the first thing that I want to say is I want to be clear about my intended purpose of this class. I call the class, civil disobedience and protesting, in Jewish law, or a Jewish view of civil disobedience and protesting. And I want to focus on that, not to the exclusion of the very prescient and relevant issues and challenges going on right now with the protests going on and fighting against the deep-seated systemic racism. So what's important to recognize about the Jewish view on protesting is that it developed in a number of ways. One is it developed in Jewish lands under Jewish kings. So part of the sources reflect that. And it also reflects this idea that the protesting is really meant to support, within our community when we see evils being done by and against our own community. However, there are explicit sources, some brought, some not, that clearly make it clear that when Jews are meant to protest, when it's appropriate to do so, it's supposed to be for all mankind, not just for Jews. But the reason I wanted to say that is so that you'll understand the way that some of these texts are written. They were written, again, in the context of what if there's a Jewish king who's doing evil? Do people have the responsibility to stand up and protest against them? But the texts themselves will be very relevant for today. So again, the first thing is that I want to focus on those sources, and that doesn't mean that they won't be relevant. However, I want these texts to really speak to the Jewish community and what their role in all of this should be. If it inspires or helps the greater conversation, that's beautiful, but I want to keep a limited question here because there's a really big and important conversation that we all should be having if we're not already. The next thing I want to say is I think it's really important, even though this class is focused on the specific question of Jews protesting against injustice, is that with what is going on right now across the world at this point, all 50 states and many different countries, is for there are people who are all across the spectrum. There are those who are fully in support of everything that's going on without question. There are those who are generally supportive but may not be happy, whatever that means, with the way that the protests are happening. And then there are those who are opposed to it. Not necessarily that they consider themselves racist, but they think that protests really just have no place here. And I think it's really important, both in tonight's class and in general when we watch the news and when we think about it, to check our own biases. Why do I say that? Because particularly for the Jewish people who still deal with anti-Semitism, but we've had moments in our history where the anti-Semitism against us has been planned and by the state, to recognize where we're coming from. So anyone who says, oh, these protests are really, they're not the right thing, is for somebody to really walk a mile in someone else's shoes, is to think, if I were in that community, in the minority community, in the Black community, in the Asian community, in the Latino community, would I feel differently? So it's important to recognize, while we think about what's going on, how much do our own personal biases and where we're coming from affect how we're approaching the issues and the questions of today. And the final thing that I want to put out there, which is not the main focus of this class, but I think it's important to have in the back of our minds as we think about the protests going on, is just to clarify some practical issues. And one that I will say, even though I'm not a historian or an expert in the way that the Black community has been treated since the days of slavery, I know enough to say with complete certainty as a fact that racism did not end with the end of slavery, nor at the end of Jim Crow. In fact, not only to this day is there widespread racism at the state level, but just a number of years ago, there were laws, committees, communities that forbid where the Black community could live, and that had real impacts, direct impacts on the quality of life, access to education, and so many things that continues to affect and plague the Black community. So the reason I bring that up is to say that this class is going to be about protesting when there's an obvious injustice. I want to say, without any political partisanship, anything like that, there is a great injustice that has and is continuing to be done. How to fix it, all the causes of it, some are certain, some are known, some not as well known. And I want to end by one final thing, just to help clarify an issue that a lot of people are being really put off by, this phrase, defund the police. And there are videos and articles that explain this far better than I will, but it's important to understand that the I don't know the majority, but generally what defund the police does not mean get rid of police officers. There is a known issue that many people have been speaking about for years. Police officers, and I personally have had police officers help me, and I like that police officer, and he was a wonderful person. Police officers are being asked to do way too much. A police officer's job should be to, deal with direct crimes, whether it's detective, whether it's a direct thing of violence, but issues where people are locked in their homes, issues where there's domestic abuse, where there's, mental illness, there's a lack of food. There's a million things that the police are asked to deal with that they're not equipped for, and they are spread too thin. And this is often what leads to many of these conflicts where someone else would be much better suited than someone who is trained to be ready to kill. And not that police officers ever should kill, but that is one of the tools that they need to have, but they're using it in the wrong situations. So defund the police doesn't mean get rid of the police. It means make the police, only give them the resources for what they're supposed to do, and then put that money into other resources, mental health, other mediators and people in society, fund the things that are way underfunded to support the people and take the pressure off the police, and then train the police better to deal with issues like racism, anger, and de-escalating things. So I think that's important to keep in the back of our minds. This is a real issue. It's not going away. It will not be resolved in a night, but one of the biggest things that people are suggesting to resolve it really isn't that crazy. So keep that in mind as now we explore the topic of what should the Jewish orientation be towards protest in general. But before I start the text, does anyone want to raise their hand and add anything or ask any clarifying questions on the topics that I just raised? Yes, Susan, I'm going to unmute you. I think you might have to unmute yourself on your side as well. Yeah, go for it, Susan.
Okay, are you going to be dealing with civil disobedience specifically as a form of protest?
So what I'll say to that is I'm going to talk about protesting in general, verbal, but there is a section that will specifically talk about, I brought a text from Gandhi who talks about, civil disobedience and being peaceful civil disobedience versus, looting, rioting, all of those things that people are critiquing. And we will look at some of the Jewish opinions on it. And one thing I forgot to say is one thing that'll help make a lot of these sources clarify them is to understand that in the Jewish mindset, somebody who is being oppressed and their rights are taken away and protesting against that isn't necessarily different than protesting against somebody who's, defiling the religion or committing idolatry. In the Jewish mindset, religious and civil matters are all combined together. Anything that is evil, which again could be in the religious sphere, idolatry, or in the civil sphere, how human beings are treated and equality, all kind of meld together. And even though we'll see it inside, I'll mention that for the prophets, the Nevi'im, one of the biggest issues by far that so many of them, Amos, Micha, all of them talked about was the vast inequality in wealth and the way that the wealthy class treated the lower class. Though they were all of the same race, as it were, many of those issues are present today, and certainly the prophets, without question, protested against that. So with that, we're going to go ahead and I will share my screen, and then we will begin. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. And Tamar, you will be the first one to read, but I'll just read the name of the section is a quote in and of itself, which will give you a hint at where the Jewish sources tend to go. Let justice well up like water, righteousness like an unfailing stream, famous from the book of Amos, the prophet. And the prophets were very concerned with justice and were clear on what justice was for them. And this quote, I don't know if anyone knows, was also one of the favorite ones of Martin Luther King Jr. And that'll come back again later. So Tamar, I'll ask you to go ahead and take this first source from the prophet Micha to just kind of orient ourselves. And again, you'll see very early on, there's a very clear ideal here amongst Jewish sources as to how we approach standing up against evil for what is right. So bevakasha, Tamar.
It's from Micah 6:8, centrality of justice. He has told you, O man, what is good and what the Lord requires of you, only to do justice and to love goodness, and to walk modestly with your God.
Excellent. And I'll just, because that was so short, I'll have you take the next one as well, Tamar. And this is from the story of, Avraham in Bereshit in the towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he finds out that they're going to be wiped off the face of the earth for their pervasive evils. Not all of which are spelled out, but we know that the way they treat people and they violate people sexually and physically, so there's true evil in those towns. But Avraham points out to God, as you'll see in this text here, that just because many of them are evil, they're not all evil, and Avraham could stay silent and say, I trust God, which we would assume that what you would do, but Avraham here says, no, I'm going to stand up to God because I see an injustice. So Tamar, bavakasha from Bereshit.
Then the Lord said, the outrage of Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grave, I will go down to see whether they have acted altogether according to the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will take note. Abraham came forward and said, will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all earth deal justly?
Excellent, thank you. And that last line there is so important, because one of the concerns might be when people protest against something, critics will say, oh, you're protesting it, you have no respect for it, they know better than you, or how you can't speak to authority that way. And here we see Avraham speaking to God, and he's the first one to recognize how great and significant God is. And the way that he does it isn't saying, God, you are terrible, you are evil. He says, God, I want you to hold to the contract, as I think Rousseau said, the social contract, which is a phrase a lot of people have been talking about today between, different communities. But Avraham says, you told me that we're going to have a relationship of justice. And I'm asking you, are you holding to that standard that you promised to me? And God's response is, yes. And then the continuation of the story is God says, if there are 50 people, if there are 40 people, 20 people, 10 people, if there's a significant number of people there who are righteous, then the just thing to do would be to spare the town on their behalf. They can't find a single righteous person. And Avraham says that was appropriate justice. We gave them a fair trial, as it were. So protesting against something is not necessarily saying that the entire system is broken or evil. It might be. It very well might be. But it's very important to know that protesting against something doesn't necessarily mean rejecting it completely. It can be asking for that system to hold by the standards that we all agree to. The next source here, and again, these next sources, they continue in the same vein, particularly the next one, Rita. I just unmuted you if you would take from Bamidbar. And here again is Korach, who was of the priestly class and stood up to Moshe and said, why should you be the leader? And, rebelling against Moshe, trying to get the people to rebel against him. And ultimately, there was going to be this test, and it was clear from the test that God was going to wipe out Korach. But Rita, if you'll see here, Moshe, it would make perfect sense for him to say, of course, God, wipe out my enemy. But instead, go ahead, Rita.
Value of mercy. Korach gathered the whole community against them at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Then the presence of the Lord appeared to the whole community, and the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, stand back from this community, that I may annihilate them in an instant. But they fell on their faces and said, O God, source of the breath of all flesh, then one man sins, will you be wrathful with the whole community?
Excellent, thank you. This is almost an analogous, almost a mirror situation to Avram in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, and that it's appropriate for them to be punished for their sins. Yet still, the person cries out and says, "Please make sure it's fair justice." And the whole thing here is Moshe owes Korach and his people nothing. Yet still, he perceives even the slightest injustice, the slightest lack of fairness, and he feels like he cannot be silent. And one thing I didn't mention about Avram, and this is true of Moshe as well, Noach was, called a righteous man in his times. And the rabbis debate, does that mean he was truly righteous always, or is only righteous compared to the people of his time? And one opinion says that compared to Avraham, he was not wicked, but he certainly wasn't that great a man, because Noach had an opportunity to speak up against the world being wiped out and to speak up for the sake of the people, to protest what was going on. And instead, he kept silent. He decided to be neutral in it, to save his own skin, as it were. And the rabbis do not look upon that well. Whereas Moshe and Avram, anytime they could stand up and fight against injustice, they did. Even if it turned out they were wrong and things were just, they always felt that they had to speak up. And these next things, I'll just quickly go through them. They're just giving you a few other examples from the Tanakh. The story of Shifra and Puah. So the Pharaoh, Paro, who was truly evil in the time of the Israelites, wanted to kill all the Israelite males, and the two midwives who helped birth the children, Shifra and Puah, rebelled against him, protested directly against him. So even though that may not seem as relevant to all our cases, the point here is, again, the Torah really holds up these peoples as paragons, as true, perfect or wonderful people for what they did. Mordechai is asked to bow down to the secular government. Again, it's idolatry, but for him, that's no different than civil injustice, and he refuses to. And he doesn't attack Haman. Mordechai just refuses to bow down. In the book of Daniel, chapter 3, I think it's Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor, leader, king, wants people again to bow down to idols, and these three men, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, again refuse to bow down. So civil disobedience, they just stand still and said, we refuse to do so. And even in the book of Maccabees, where one can say, well, in the book of Maccabees, they did stand up and fight against them. It's a little different because it was more a war for survival, but there are cases in the book of Maccabees where Antiochus specifically told the people to eat treif, and the people refused to do that. So they went on, a hunger strike, as it were, and the result is that they were killed. So this also gets into the area of martyrdom and Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's name through our actions. But the point here is that we have many, many examples of people standing up for what is right. And now, as we're about to see, we're going to see that reflected very clearly, very explicitly in rabbinic texts. So I'm going to go ahead and unmute Elizabeth and welcome Elizabeth. If you would please read source number 5 from the Talmud Bavli, go for it and see how the rabbis of the Talmud feel about people who choose to speak up or not speak up. Go for it.
It was related that Rav and Rabbi Hanina and Rabbi Yochanan and Rav Haviva taught the statements cited below. The Gemara comments, throughout the order of Moed, wherever this pair of sages is mentioned, exchange Rabbi Yochanan and insert Rabbi Yonatan. Please, thank you. In any event, they said, anyone who had the capability to effectively protest the sinful conduct of the members of his household and did not protest, he himself is apprehended for the sins of the members of his household and punished. If he is in a position to protest the sinful conduct of the people of his town and he fails to do so, he is apprehended for the sins of the people of his town. If he is in a position to protest the sinful conduct of the whole world and he fails to do so, he is apprehended for the sins of the whole world.
Excellent, thank you. So what we're going to see between this text and the next few is once an injustice is perceived, and again, as I said, many of these texts make no distinction between sins. So if a Jew sees that all of his people are breaking some very apparent Jewish law, not a minor one, but a major one, then he or she has the responsibility to stop them. So if someone's living in a house and notices that their children are breaking certain laws, now it doesn't say that it has to beat them, throw them in jail, capital punishment. All it says is they have to protest. They have to say explicitly what you are doing is wrong. There's even a mitzvah called tochecha, rebuke here. But one must speak up. And then they expand that and say if one can speak up and perhaps, it doesn't mean that his protests will necessarily work, but if one speaks up and might affect their household and they don't, then they get all of the punishment and sins and consequences that fall on their house, and they expand that. If someone's voice could speak to the community and they're silent, they have to carry the sins of the community, and so too worldwide. So one of the questions many people might be asking themselves is, what good could I do? I do feel like I'm angry, and I feel strongly about protesting systemic racism, and there are many other areas that should be protested against as well, but who's going to listen to me? So I, Rabbi Din, and I don't know how many people would listen to me, but certainly my shul would. Doesn't mean they'll necessarily change how they feel or what they do, but I know that I have their ears. So it's my responsibility to speak up. Certainly in my household, fortunately, my wife and I are on the same page, and my kids have varying levels of understanding. But if somebody has a group that will at least be willing to open their ears and hear what you have to say, one must speak up. And we see that very emphatically in this next source here, Susan. I think you also, again, have to unmute yourself on your side. And even though this is a short source, the context here in this Midrash, from Midrash Rabbah Shemot Rabbah, is that there was this plan to enslave the Jews. And there are a number of historical figures who are all included in this, even if they historically never existed at the same time. That's never the point of the Midrash. The point is that these three people were somehow involved in the conversation to enslave the Israelites. So go ahead, Susan, source number 6.
Okay, sin of silence. Here Bar Abba said in the name of Rav Simai, there were 3 involved in that plan, Bilam, Yov, and Yitro. Bilam, who advised it, was slain. Yov was silent, was afflicted with suffering, and Yitro, who fled, his descendants were rewarded.
Excellent. So again, while this is Midrash, this didn't actually happen, but the rabbis are making a point here. When there is some great injustice, there are essentially 3 ways to respond to it. One would, I suppose, be to support it, and that one will, result in the rabbinic mind with death or some great kind of punishment. But one who is neutral will also be punished. Neutrality is not an option. There are consequences for remaining neutral. And Yitro, even though it says he Shebarach, he ran away, essentially it means that he totally rejected the plan to enslave the Israelites. And we know that he had an incredible end and a positive influence on the development of the Torah and our Jewish history, in Moshe, et cetera, like that. But it's not enough to just not say anything. One has to actively protest against it to not be swallowed up in the consequences of it. This next work here is from the Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Low, who again, at least mythologically, was famous for creating the golem. And I went to his shul, looked in the window, and did not see a golem there. Sherman, I'm just unmuting you for this text. And I will say as a general statement, the Maharal of Prague is one of my favorite rabbis for his ethical approach to the world. And he had started this whole conversation in one of his great works, called Netivot Olam. And he was quoting this phrase about every Israelite, every Jew is responsible for one another. So again, even though the original context, a lot of these is how should the Jewish community look out for each other, it's still very much understood in a global sense. And what he says is the Jewish body, and I'm expanding it to the body of America and really the global community, are like one big body. And if one part of our body sees that another part of our body is hurt, is in pain, and does nothing, if I'm cut on one hand and I refuse to put a Band-Aid with my other hand, even though that sounds a little odd, I'm responsible for that wound getting deeper. So he says the body has to look out for all the parts, because if we ignore the injustice against one community, it really does affect all communities. And we've seen this reflected in poetry, after the Holocaust, certainly, when they came for the Jews, I did nothing. When they came for this group, I did nothing, etc. When injustice is allowed to, rot and continue to spread, the effects will hurt everyone. And I think today, even if people don't see it or refuse to see it, what's happening in all minority communities absolutely affects everyone. So Sherman, go ahead and source number 7.
Therefore, any individual who has the opportunity to prevent wrongdoing and does not, becomes caught up in the violations committed by the other, since he had the opportunity to prevent it. For this is God's design, that each gives sustenance to all, and if not, each causes ruin to all.
Excellent, thank you. One of the reasons this source, besides the fact that it's so powerful and beautiful, is I think it's very relevant today, because part of the conversation that a lot of people are saying is, again, being neutral. Not being part of the solution is being part of the problem. And a lot of people push back and say that's not fair. And there's two parts to the not being fair. One is to say, I cannot protest in the way that others. That's valid. Not everyone is able to do that for a lot of reasons, particularly, and let's not forget, coronavirus and COVID-19 has not gone away. However, I think the text here talks about, a certain opportunity. If someone has an opportunity in their own way, whether it's by, again, talking to their synagogue, talking to their friends, family, and a Facebook post is very easy. And if that's, the least someone can do, maybe that's not enough. But if someone really does what they are able to, or someone has an opportunity to do more, to protest against something, and they choose not to help the problem, then they're allowing the problem to continue. And this is key. And that's why I brought this text here. Our tradition, the Jewish tradition, says that somebody who sees an evil and does nothing becomes part of that evil. And again, one could say, well, that wouldn't necessarily apply to everything going on today. I am choosing to apply it. However, the text there is pretty powerful and really speaks to it. Yeah, Sherman, I'll unmute you again. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that really correlates to that slogan that they're using in the protest, silence is complicity. So I just think that relates to it.
Yeah, and I think this source, I personally think it does reflect that. And the one thing that I do want to say, it's important because I also want to speak to where, my family is and where the community is. There are different ways to protest and speak out. And if we have some time at the end, people can share some ideas on it. Not all protesting has to look the same. And to give you an example, source number 8, we won't read inside, is very powerful, again, from the work of Josephus, from the first century, second century, who was a Jew who actually betrayed his people to the Romans. And then he ended up writing one of the most important histories of the Jewish people. But he tells the story of the Emperor Caligula from the year 37 to 41 of the Common Era, who wanted to put put an idol in the Jewish temple. And the Jews refused to allow it. So he sent one of his generals, Petronius, and said, if you protest, then Caligula will send his army who could wipe you out in a second. And the end of this section here is they replied, we will not by any means make war with Caesar, but we will die before we see our laws transgressed. So they would rather die than allow, evil and sin and injustice to come into their midst. And I think that's a very powerful source to show how far people will go. But I'm also using as an example of people don't have to go that far. People don't have to put their lives on the line in protest. But it's very clear from all the sources that we've seen, and we'll continue to see these next two sources, that silence is not an option. One has to speak out in some way, shape, or form. Silence is not an option. And this next source here, a beautiful one, we actually don't know the author, Lynn, I'm just unmuting you right now, Orchot Tzadikim, the paths or the ways of the righteous, and it's available in English online and in print. It's one of the most beautiful works about how to live an ethical life. And he talks about the sin of flattery, but that's not the reason that I brought this particular text here. So go ahead, Lynn, source number 9.
Rooting out evil. The sixth category of flattery is he who is in a position to protest against an evil and does not protest, nor does he pay any attention to the deeds of the sinners. This thing comes close to flattery, for then the sinners think, as long as they do not protest and do not reproach us, all of our deeds must be good. But we have been commanded to root out the evil from our midst. As it is said, so shalt thou put away the evil from the midst of thee.
Thank you. So there's two important things here initially. One is that people often kid and fool themselves about ignoring injustice. and thinking that as long as I'm not involved in it directly, I'm not a part of the problem. And he turns it around and says, no. It's not a matter of by being neutral, you're not feeding the flames. It's that we have a direct obligation to actively try and uproot evil from this world. And that's the really important takeaway from all of these sources. It's not just a don't stand idly by, which is another mitzvah, don't stand idly by the blood of our fellow and our neighbor. It's that we actively must be seeking out injustice. Now, as the Jewish people, we've certainly been the victims of injustice for millennia, and in many communities, in many instances, still are. And in some ways, the Jewish community has become very insular, protecting ourselves. And the idea of tikkun olam, while it's become very popular in certain denominations, particularly in the Orthodox world, while we do give charity, the idea of actively being prophetic and saying, God didn't just choose us to sit around and eat gefilte fish. God chose us to make this world a better place. And that mission has been lost. And again, not everyone can or even should, again, with the coronavirus, should be marching on the streets. But it's very clear from these sources, and that's why I'm pointing them explicitly, that every Jew must do something in their own way. But the other thing that's really powerful here, and I can bring a real contemporary example, is this text was written in 15th century in Germany. There was a custom in Germany and Eastern Europe and Western European lands in the 15th and 16th century of protesting in the middle of services. But before I explain that, the next source here from the Shulchan Aruch, again, the 1563 codification of Jewish law, is talking about the laws of prayer. And to back up, whenever someone eats something or does a commandment, a mitzvah, there's usually a blessing before, and it's important that the blessing and the action are connected. There's no separation. So if I say the blessing over an apple, I don't put the apple down, go away for 10 minutes, come back and eat the apple. And those separations, those hefsekot, those breaks, are also part of prayer. There are certain parts of prayer that must go together. This section of prayer and this section of prayer, there can't be any kind of separation because they are thematically linked with each other. However, it says here in verse 10, and I'll just go read this one just because it gets very technical. So at the end of the preliminary prayers made up mostly of Psalms of King David, of the Tehillim, the end there's this beautiful prayer, Yishtabach, and then it goes into the sections before Shema Yotzer. And it says, one who speaks between Yishtabach and Yotzer, those two major sections of prayer, it is a sin in his hand. So if someone gets up in the middle of shul or a rabbi and gives it Dvar Torah, other than announcing the page, no one should be talking then. So many rabbis would say, wink, wink, forget about protest. This also means no talking in shul, but that's not what we care about here. And would be required to return from the battlefield due to fear of sin leading to death. So it shows that interrupting during that part of the prayer is so egregious that if that person then went out to battle, that sin would be on their shoulders, and it's more likely they'd be killed in battle because they talked at that point in tefillah. That's a big deal. Whether or not that's true, the rabbis here are emphasizing how serious it is to interrupt in the middle of prayer. But, aval, there are those who say that it is permitted to interrupt at that point for communal needs or to bestow charity to those who come to be provided for from charity. And then Rabbi Moshe Isserlis amends and adds on, from this stems the custom in many places to say a blessing for the sick or for a claimant to ask for judgment between Yishtabach and Yotzer, because these are instances of interruptions for the purpose of a mitzvah. And after that, when they resume praying, the leader says a bit of Psukei de Zimra and then Kaddish on those verses, since one needs to have verses before Kaddish. But what this custom was is that in the middle of services, if someone knew there was an injustice, whether it was the secular government taxing them or something that they saw in the Jewish community, corruption, they would stand up. And that it's not only that they were allowed to interrupt if it was for that reason, that it became the custom to specifically interrupt there. And there's a contemporary rabbi who is a brilliant rabbi, very much a social activist, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, and his wife wrote, the book on creating a Jewish household. But famously, I just learned from my brother-in-law, I don't recall the actual space where it was, but he got up in services at that point in the prayer and spoke about, number of issues that were going on. And it wasn't only permitted, it was appropriate. And as we've seen before, perhaps one must do it. But the way that this was used is people would get up and they would yell and scream about the injustices and corruption that were going on in the middle of prayer. Because what meaning does prayer have if it's in the context of people allowing injustice to surround them? When we pray to God to make our lives in this world a better place, but we ignore real actions that we could do to make it better, our prayer loses a great deal of its meaning. So it's not an interruption. It almost becomes a form of prayer. So before we move on to the next section, which is very important, and Susan had asked about it, about whether violent civil disobedience, I'm going to pause for a moment. If anyone has a question, raise your hand and I'll unmute you. So I'll give a moment to just look through the people. Those, again, who are only on audio, at the end, I'll unmute everyone and you can ask your questions then. Excellent. So Leonard and Gloria, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you for these next sources. So I actually brought in a source from Gandhi, Mohandas Gandhi, who was, in modern day, was the leader and kind of the progenitor of civil disobedience, or at least really codified it for a lot of people. I'm not an expert on the whole history of it, but he speaks very beautifully about how civil disobedience can look, and then what happens when it's no longer effective. So go ahead, Gloria, source number 1 at the bottom of the page.
He who resorts to civil disobedience obeys the laws of the state to which he belongs, not out of fear of sanctions, but because he considers them to be good for the welfare of society. But there come occasions, generally rare, when he considers certain laws to be so unjust as to render obedience to them a dishonor. He then openly and civilly breaks them and quietly suffers the penalty for their breach.
So there's something, thank you, Larry. There's something I didn't point out earlier, which is that in every example from the Torah of protest, no one did anything violent. They were all either actions of refusing to do something, refusing to eat something, or in the case of the Maccabees, I didn't bring one example where they were asked to do something forbidden and they simply just ran away. And I don't think that was an act of cowardice. That was an act of refusing to follow the Greek king, Antiochus. But what Gandhi is, or at least my understanding, saying here is, first of all, one ideally should be protesting in a way which is not violent, but not because he's afraid of getting thrown in jail. In fact, he's not really talking about violence here. He's really saying that one shouldn't be breaking other laws other than the unjust one. But perhaps at the point when all of the laws are unjust or no one is paying attention, then one should take it to the next level. However, here, I'll give you an example, the protesters who are staying out past curfew. Now, in many cases, curfew can be a law or practice that can help protect people. But in this case, it was clearly one that was unjust to stop the protesters. So that is not, staying out past curfew was not a violent form of resistance. It was breaking laws, but it was still ultimately peaceful protesting. So Gandhi here, I don't think is implying that one should ever turn to violence. I think he's saying here there are different levels of protesting and breaking laws. So, going on certain pieces of land where one shouldn't, putting up things that they shouldn't, how far this could go. Would he consider graffiti or certain forms of vandalism? And again, not smashing shops, but, putting up signs on buildings that would deface them, whatever that means, to make their statement. He might say, as long as, that's what needs to happen. And even though it's breaking some laws, it's not violent, it seems that he would say that's okay as a next step. But again, here, it seems like he's not saying that violence is ever okay. It's a matter of, ideally, we follow all the laws because ultimately they're there to keep society together. However, once those laws become part of an unjust system, like if it becomes against the law to put out radio stations against the state, as we see, unfortunately, in a number of countries in the world, then he would say, broadcast away. One was living in North Korea, I think Gandhi would say, broadcast to your heart's content. In China, even though China's come a long way, it's still forbidden in many cases, or all the way back to Soviet Russia, and perhaps to some extent still in Russia today, where it might be forbidden to publish certain things. Gandhi would say, publish away. That is breaking the law, but it is not violent, and it is very much in the context of civil disobedience. But now we're going to look at two sources here, and again, I might explain at least the first one, because it may not make too much sense out of context, is the first source here on the top of page 4 from the Talmud is based on a Mishnah, and it talks about do Jews have to essentially respect secular law when it comes to taxes? And the rabbis have one opinion that says, no, we don't have to, follow laws. It's not paying taxes isn't considered stealing from secular governments. The rabbis are deeply troubled by that, and they say that only applies where the government is corrupt. And in that case, if they're actually corrupt, then one doesn't have to pay taxes. But in a regular government where corruption is not there, there's a phrase that is originated in this source, famous, important, powerful phrase, Dina de Malchuta Dina. Literally, the law of the king is the law, but today it's understood as the law of the land is the law. For example, copyright infringement. There may or may not be a clear basis for that in Jewish law, but in the United States of America, it doesn't matter. It is a fine law. There's nothing unjust about it. Ethically, it's a perfectly good law. Jews must follow it. So if there are laws that are not unjust, then Jews are obligated to follow them, and nothing can allow us to break it unless, again, we're in danger, there's life or death. So where that comes up, we'll see in this next source here, and Leonard, I'm going to have you read the next big source, but this is, again, the Shulchan Aruch, the codification of law, and it talks about stealing. And it says that stealing any amount, even if one is playing a game or like on Pesach night, when children steal the afikomen and bribe their parents, technically that's forbidden. But it says here that even to damage someone, even with the intention to give it back, stealing is never permitted. We'll actually see the source come up again at the end of the class, but the point here is that even though protesting is an obligation, Jews do not have the option of being silent, that unless a law is unjust, we still must also follow all other civil laws. So the breaking in windows, stealing, et cetera, like that. And again, that's a huge question. And there's a lot of powerful statements about why people are doing it. But ultimately, if someone says, what's the Jewish view on protesting? The short answer is protest, but destroying property is never permitted. And again, the exception would be if destroying property of someone evil or someone who's trying to attack us, but then it would be life or death or a war setting. But in the context of today's protest, Jewish law is explicit. We must speak up however we can in the way that we are able to, but there is no permission for any kind of public damage. All other civil laws that are meant for the protection of society stand. So smashing a window to make a statement is not permitted in Jewish law. And again, we'll see that said again by one of the most progressive social activists in the Orthodox Jewish world at the end of this class. So now that we've kind of laid down those basics, I want to pause here and see if there are any questions, comments, or responses before we go on to our final sources. And again, those who are on the phone, you'll have an opportunity to speak. Oh, Susan, yeah. Oh no, Susan, you were just, sorry, I just muted you, but you were unmuted. You have to unmute yourself again. Okay, yeah, go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, so civil disobedience, the idea comes from Henry David Thoreau.
Oh, thank you. As I said, I wasn't sure about the whole development of it. Yeah, please.
Yeah, but what happened, it has to be nonviolent. If it becomes violent, or if the destruction of property is something, then it's not civil disobedience. But he refused to pay taxes to support a war to extend slavery, and so he went to jail because he refused to pay his taxes. You have to be willing to accept the consequences, but it's the same principle. If it's an unjust law, then you have an obligation to violate it.
So I think that based on what you said, Henry David Thoreau's way of understanding civil disobedience fits very well with Jewish law. And again, that doesn't mean that all of us need to be willing to go to jail. And by the way, many of my colleagues at my yeshiva did protest true injustices, and they did end up in jail, and it was a mark of pride for them. And there were others who, needed to get home to watch their kids at night and couldn't afford to go to jail, but that doesn't mean that they can be silent. So there has to be something in between, at least from the Jewish perspective. So that understanding of civil disobedience and very explicit sources that talk about damage as not being permitted in the with general laws, even in the context of protesting. So that again is the Jewish. Now, I said at the beginning, I'm speaking to the Jewish community. Now, that doesn't mean that if someone said, Rabbi, you say Jews are not allowed to do any kind of vandalism to stand up for what they believe in, but everyone else is allowed to. I'm not saying that, but I do want to focus in on the way that our sources speak to the Jewish community, and hopefully this will become a conversation that everyone will have. And by the way, even though I'm spending time on this section, the vast, vast, vast majority, like a super majority by far, of protesters worldwide have not been violent. It's been a very small percentage, and also at the beginning, there was a little bit more violence, and it's petered off to a great extent. Unfortunately, a lot of the violence came from law enforcement. And my understanding of that is based on obviously what I'm seeing in the media, and I know there's always two sides to every story, but I can say with confidence, the vast majority of protesters had been peaceful, and the laws that they broke, i.e. curfew, it's entirely appropriate. And that might be an example of when Henry David Thoreau would say, of course you break curfew without question. And I think even in Milwaukee, if not Wisconsin, the Attorney General said, of course I'm not going to prosecute anyone for breaking curfew, which is the right response. So the last section here, we're going to look at two different modern responses. They're very, very different. The first one is from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. He came from Poland. He had a classical yeshivish education. And he actually, in a classical Jewish academy. And in fact, I don't think he actually received ordination from that, classical Orthodox. He received it in a more academic, modern, non-denominational school. And he became an academic philosopher, came to the States. He actually got out. He was taught in Warsaw for a number of years, but was able to get out of Poland before World War II and the Holocaust began. He was able to get to London and ultimately to the United States under the auspices of the Hebrew Union College, the main institution of the Reform movement, taught there for I think 5 years, then ultimately ended up at the Jewish Theological Seminary, the conservative movement's flagship institution. And he's now associated with conservative Judaism. However, his training and his teachings really are universal and global, and everyone should learn them. And he became a dear friend of Martin Luther King Jr. And even though the Jewish community writ large did not call upon him to be their representative during the civil rights movement, he really became that and was invited by presidents to speak on their behalf. And again, whether or not he was the best one we ever could have had, he really did rise to the occasion. And in one of his speeches, he spoke about justice, and he actually spoke to the Jewish community, specifically the white Jewish community, about their implicit role in racism. And he does that by playing on the idea of Egypt and Israel, because classically, I'm Israel, I'm a Jew, I'm Israel, and Egypt is everyone else. But he flipped things on his head, and it became that white Jews, who for the most part were actually, free and had money and had resources and had the ability to essentially help mold society, became the Egyptians. So Leonard, thank you for your patience. If you would take, and this is actually from a beautiful article that you can find the source for, that speaks a lot about both Rabbi Heschel and Martin Luther King. So go for it.
Heschel used similar imagery when writing about civil rights, but he used the imagery to rebuke white audiences for their racism. American Jews, too, were Egyptians in Heschel's retelling. At his first major address on the subject at a conference on religion and race, sponsored by the National Conference of Christians and Jews in Chicago on January 14, 1963, the occasion where Heschel and King first met, Heschel opened his speech by returning to the present day in biblical history. Quote, at the first conference on religion and race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. The outcome of that summit meeting has not come to an end. Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate. The Exodus began, but is far from having been completed. In fact, it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a Negro to cross certain university campuses. In February 1964, at another conference held at a time when white resistance in America was increasing, Heschel reminded his audience that Israelites, just after leaving Egypt, had complained of the bitter water they found at Marah, asking Moses, "What shall we drink?" Chiding his audience, Heschel writes, "This episode seems shocking. What a come down. Only 3 days earlier, they had reached the highest peak of prophetic and spiritual exaltation. And now they complain about such a prosaic and unspiritual item as water. The Negroes of America behave just like the children of Israel."
Excellent. Thank you. And I believe.
Oh, we are not available now.
Sorry.
No worries. Oh, it continues on. Go ahead, Leonard. Only in 1963.
Only in 1963, they experienced the miracle of having turned the tide of history, the joy of finding millions of Americans involved in the struggle for civil rights, the exaltation of the fellowship, the march to Washington. Now, only a few months later, they have the audacity to murmur, "What shall we drink? We want adequate education, decent housing, proper employment." How ordinary, how unpoetic, how annoying. We are ready to applaud dramatic struggles once a year in Washington. For the sake of lofty principles, we will spend a day or two in jail somewhere in Alabama. The tragedy of Pharaoh was the failure to realize that the exodus from slavery could have spelled redemption for both Israel and Egypt. Would that Pharaoh and the Egyptians had joined the Israelites in the desert and together stood at the foot of Sinai.
Excellent. There's a lot to unpack here, a lot of different levels going on here, and again, how he plays with the identity of each group and turning modern-day Jews in America, at least in the 1960s during the civil rights movement, into the Egyptians. But I want to focus on a few different parts of it. One is something that he says explicitly is, the community can only handle one big, event a year. And, once we've gone through that big civil uprising in Washington, then all of the follow-up work, which is so important, and I think he's being quite sarcastic there. He says, they've been given civil rights, and now they want education, and now they want to be treated equally. What's wrong with them? They already got a piece of paper that at least says they sort of have it. So he chides them for it. And in many ways, the Israelites, it's kind of the opposite, where they get this incredibly, when they came out of Egypt, they get this incredible moment, this height of crossing through the Sea of Reeds, where they're at the height, they get everything they want from God, and then they're complaining about all the little nitpicky things because they don't appreciate it. Well, here it's flipped on its head. The huge event in Washington is not the thing. It's not the miracle of Egypt. It's not the big event that solved everything. It's all of the nitpicky things that are so important that people didn't want to deal with. But there's a few important takeaways from this overall piece. And one is that the Jewish community, in many ways, has had opportunities to be more supportive of minority, particularly, specifically the Black community. And I'm sure there are many members of the Jewish community who did rise to the occasion, particularly Rabbi Heschel, although the article goes on to say, none of us, or few of us, can actually be a Rabbi Heschel, meaning that most people did not rise to that occasion. So this is an issue that's been, an opportunity for the Jewish community for generations to stand up and do something about. But the other part of it that's so important, again, relevant today, is people are crying out for change. And certain institutions and certain government levels, they say, here's a token change, which shouldn't be seen, shouldn't be completely ignored. But the issue is, it's all been token changes. There needs to be major change on the minute level. And nitpicky is a negative word, but on the small local level, major underlying systemic changes to the system. And Rabbi Heschel said, we are ignoring all that. We're so excited about that. We got civil rights passed. That's one tiny part that begins the puzzle, but we need to keep building. So, and that's very, very true today. I don't know how long these protests go on. Maybe they will last for months more until major changes continue, or maybe they'll peter out in a couple weeks. Part of that might be affected by the virus and how much it does or doesn't spike in communities. But the whole point here is this: no matter how huge a problem or how huge an uprising in the world, eventually it does quiet down. Sometimes there are amazing changes, sometimes moderate ones. But this has been going on for hundreds of years. And just because we're looking back at 1963, it doesn't matter. The changes to make this world a better place have to be constant. And what's most important for Jews is that to make sure that's constant, we always need to be rooting out injustice. We can't say we fixed the problem, now let's relax for 40 or 50 years. There's always an injustice. If we ever get to the point where there are no longer injustices, then we're living in the Garden of Eden, the Messiah, Mashiach has come. Beautiful. I pray for that. We're not there yet. And just everything Heschel said in 1963 is just as relevant today. And the final piece here I want to share is actually from a friend of mine, Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz, a graduate of my school. And Rabbi Yanklowitz is interesting because he is one of the most powerful, outspoken social activists. And oftentimes he gets highly criticized, and people say, oh, don't stir up the waters. You're making everybody think people from our school and modern Orthodoxy are a bunch of nut jobs. Well, this is his moment. First of all, he's not. He's an incredible human being who always stands up for what is right. But this is really his moment to shine. Now, he wrote a piece. This is actually from 2017. So it's a few years old, but it's very relevant today. And it was after what happened in Charlottesville. And he's going to actually bring back some of the conversations we saw earlier. But he says here in this piece, and I urge people, look at the, I guess maybe I'll post the articles when I post the video later and send it out. But he says, unfortunately, since Jews have been marginalized and persecuted throughout history, civil disobedience applied to fulfilling Jewish needs. So that's what I said. Most of these sources developed out of the fact that Jews were marginalized and oppressed, and they were about protesting our situation. Today, however, where Jews are accepted as full citizens in so many modern nations and are even empowered to act with self-determination without recourse, and that's despite the fact that there's real anti-Semitism. That's a real thing. But I think everyone in this call, hopefully, can admit that even if we've experienced anti-Semitism, we have it really good in America. And not in all countries, but in many countries we do. So he continues, we must also consider civil disobedience on behalf of other persecuted groups and marginalized populations that are discriminated against. Another place in his article, he brought a Rabbi Maharik, which is an acronym for this rabbi, who explicitly says that the protesting applies to all communities who are oppressed, not just the Jews. To be sure, all civil disobedience must be nonviolent. At the same time, it is also crucial that one not vandalize or cause damage to others' property in the pursuit of their goals. And he brought the source that we saw earlier, Shulchan Aruch. Further, it is important not to shame the police who arrest you for your activism, since they are merely doing their job. That line may not ring, as positively now. People may have more trouble with it, but it's still important that he says it. Assuming they handle matters professionally, legally, and non-violently. So that line still is relevant today when that parenthesis is true. It is also important where possible to not cause any damage by causing those driving to work to be late and potentially lose wages. One's civil disobedience should be prophetic and bold, but should also be effective, thoughtful, and strategic. So what that civil disobedience looks like, whether it's blocking traffic or standing on the side and holding up signs, there are many different spectrums of it. His final lines should be as relevant, even to the most extreme form of protesting, which is that it should be prophetic. Speak loudly, speak for justice, do not be silent, but also make sure that what one is doing is effective, thoughtful, and strategic. So that doesn't mean that thousands of people should not be marching in the street, but that they should actually stop and think about it. The truth is, there are many incredible leaders who are rising out of this movement, who are doing that, who are making sure that the protests have value. And in fact, on Facebook, there's a group for people living on the East Side. And by looking at that, I can see comments and see how people stand on the issue and see how people are communicating with each other, looking out for each other. And it's not just about fighting injustice, it's also about how can we come together as a community to make real effective change. And the final thing that I want to do is, again, to summarize what we've seen here, which is that just like the prophets who were beaten down thrown in pits for their words, for standing up for what is right, we must be ready. We don't have a choice to stay silent. We must speak out. And again, that will look different for everybody. My call here is not for everyone to go out in the streets, but for those who it's safe to do so. And particularly because of coronavirus, I'm much more cautious. If there wasn't the virus, then there's a group of rabbis who has been protesting and I would be standing with them. But the coronavirus is real. However, there are many, many ways to protest. And there are also ways to support the protesters through donating to certain organizations, through giving water, through giving sanctuary, through just standing at your doorway when they go by and saying, I believe in you. And for those people who, and again, I don't know where everybody sits on this call. There may be people on this call who say, a lot of that was nice, Rabbi, but I really don't agree with X, Y, and Z. What I'll ask is, think about why. Think about why. Remember, check our biases. Why do we not support it? If it's those who are violent and did vandalism, Jewish law fully supports that is not the way to act. And even those who would say, Rabbi, how dare you in your Judaism tell us that we shouldn't be doing this? That's not what I'm saying. I'm telling you that the Jewish sources, this is the way that Jews are meant to protest the civil disobedience. But the whole point is that each person must speak up in the way that is right for them, but silence is not an option. And at the end of this call, when I unmute everyone, I'll give everyone an opportunity. If anyone has a charity or an organization that they want to suggest, I personally welcome it, and I welcome others to share their suggestions.